The air is still. The land, vast and empty, stretches before you under an empty, heavy sky. In the distance, a shadow grows. Mordor, its fires faintly flickering on the horizon. The white city of Minas Tirith waits, perched on the edge of hope and despair. There you stand on the ramparts with Gandalf and Pippin, the weight of what's to come pressing on your chest. Pippin asks, "Is it time?" And Gandalf replies, "Yes." Pippin, young, anxious, says, "But it's so quiet." "It's the deep breath before the plunge," replies Gandalf. Pippin then turns to the wizard and asks the unspoken question that's been lingering between them. Is there any hope? Gandalf doesn't answer that question right away. Instead, he takes a deep breath himself, looking out across the darkening land, and after a moment, he sighs and says, "There never was much hope, just a fool's hope." I fear that this is where we find ourselves today, standing on the walls of a besieged city in a moment heavy with anticipation, peering into an uncertain future. And like the wizard Gandalf, we here today recognize that this is not the time for easy answers. Today is Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Sunday, and tomorrow a new government administration will take over. Many of us here today are worried. Many of us here today have fears about what the future holds, how it will affect those we love, how it will impact democracy in our nation, and our hopes for justice and progress in our time. Just as the characters from J.R.R. Tolkien's beloved Lord of the Rings fantasy novels, this moment, our moment, is not quiet or really empty. It's very full of tension, full of possibility, full of questions that will define what comes next. What will we do? Who will we become? How will we face the shadow ahead? And today, all we can do is wait. And in that spirit, I'm reminded of a pair of thinkers whose words may provide us some provocation, if not comfort. I want to start with William R. Jones, a Black Unitarian theologian and philosopher who back in 1973 asked his friends and family and colleagues in the Black church a startling question. Jones was curious about the traditional teachings about providence. These teachings say that God has a plan for everyone, that everything is going to work out, that God will redeem everyone, that God will come in glory, and that justice will roll down like water. That's all well and good, Jones said, but he also argued that it is entirely unfair to judge anyone by what they have yet to do. Instead, if we're to judge anyone at all, the only good and valid evidence we have for that judgment is history, the tally of what they have already done. And so it is that if God was worthy of his name, worthy of our praise, worthy of the gospel itself, then surely, somewhere, there would be something we can point to, something we can reference, something we can judge that would demonstrate the love we say God has. something that would demonstrate the power we say God has, something that would demonstrate the justice we say God is. And yet, Jones said, when black people look for such evidence, that evidence is suspiciously scarce. It's almost as if justice was an empty promise. Instead, the gospel message he heard preached was like the advice you might hear from bigots and racists and capitalist extractors, from anyone who benefits from oppression continuing on just as it always has. The message Jones heard told the hurting, the disenfranchised, the marginalized, and the oppressed that they should stay silent, stay still, just wait. Let the bad people have their fun because God will punish them all. God will make it right. Not today, of course, no, but someday. God will make it right. And that's why William Jones, hearing this theology from the pulpit, wondered aloud, is God a white racist? I think most of us here today will agree with Jones. This is just not okay. This is terrible theology. In fact, it's absurd. But it's also a conclusion that seems unavoidable because justice delayed is justice denied. And if that's what God wanted, then the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the Ku Klux Klan have a lot in common. Jones's 1973 book, as I mentioned, Is God a White Racist?, was a challenge to the black church, to James Cone and his black liberation theology, to Martin Luther King Jr. and his dreams, to Howard Thurman preaching about the crown placed over our heads, that crown that we will one day grow tall enough to wear. Jones said that each of these teachers, each of these black leaders, each of these great figures must answer the lament, "How long, Lord?" and do it in a way that does not keep the oppressed complacent in their chains, that does not tell the suffering to just sit around and wait, that does not let the arc of history fly past a dangerous present. Now, you will likely understand and agree that the church is and must be a balm for the weary and the afflicted. That's part of the point of church, after all. But faith must be more than comfort. The gospel message of hope, redemption, and resurrection all seem to demand this. And that's why Jones wants to remind us that faith alone is just not enough. We were put here not to believe a thing, but to do a thing. We were put here to make the world a better place. We are here to act. To be fair, Jones did not invent this critique. The book of James in the Bible, the book of James, chapter 2, tells us that faith without works is empty, stupid, pointless, and dead. That's a quote from my forthcoming translation due out this year. The book of James made a lot of theologians uncomfortable. For the record, Martin Luther, not Jr., but Martin Luther, was big on an idea he called sola fide, faith alone. And that's why he wanted to rip this book from his Lutheran Bible. William Jones is one of a long line of thinkers taking issue with Luther. Like he said, faith alone is well and good, but Jones is looking at the newspaper and wants to remind everyone that God just isn't out there visiting 10 plagues on the president or Pharaoh these days. Instead, Jones suggests that we are the ones we've been waiting for. Even if we have no idea what we're doing, even if we have no idea what the outcome will be, Jones tells us that if we want the arc of the moral universe to bend towards anything, much less justice, then ours must always be the hands doing that bending. To be clear, you've probably heard this from me before, that our salvation, if any is on offer, will only ever come from us, our minds, our hearts, our hands. Again, that's from my upcoming book, tentatively titled The House of Blasphemy and Deceit, Unitarian Universalism in a Post-Trump Era. Now, I want to suggest that it takes a certain kind of courage to say yes in situations like ours, like our present times, times that call us forward. Us without mystical knowledge, without superhuman power, just us regular people, ordinary little hobbits. Maybe that's why I find The Lord of the Rings a rich place for inspiration in dark times. If you are a fan, let me remind you of a scene in the first book. Scene with Frodo Baggins standing among the Council of Elrond, hidden in the city of Lothlorien, surrounded by representatives of the peoples of Middle-earth, all of them arguing what to do with the lethally dangerous power of the One Ring. And you may remember that it was Frodo, small and untested, who stepped forward and volunteered to bear the ring across a very dangerous world, all the way to Mordor and Mount Doom, the one place it might be destroyed. A foolish hope. Yes. But sometimes that's all we have. In recent sermons, I've turned to a more modern wisdom, one found in Timothy Snyder's small book on tyranny, where he reminds us that courage often begins in the small, unnoticed moments, those moments where we decide not to yield to fear, apathy, and despair. Snyder's book offers us 20 lessons that resonate deeply in this time and call us to action today. I want to remind you of 3 in particular. You may remember that Snyder warns us to, quote, quote, most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer it without being asked, end quote. And that's why the first lesson is this: do not obey in advance. Snyder wants to remind us that our silence, our acquiescence, even in the face of small injustices, is what paves the way for greater harms. To not obey in advance means staying alert to the subtle ways that norms shift, how hatred and anger become acceptable, how symbols of oppression are tolerated, how truth is bent until it breaks. You've all seen this love for alternative fact yourselves. You have been puzzled and amazed by the brazenness of it, and you know more of it is coming. And you know you must resist these shifts. You must call them out, name them for what they are, and keep on doing so. But it is not enough to wait for the moment when the danger is clear, because that may be too late. We must act in the present as it happens and before the burden grows too heavy to carry. Snyder's next lesson is this. It's his 4th in his list. It's this. It's take responsibility for the face of the world. He means by this seeing clearly, even when the truth is uncomfortable. It means acknowledging the injustices in our own communities and refusing to let hate take root. It means acting and removing the signs of hate yourself. Like Frodo stepping forward, we must say, I will take this burden. but it also means something more profound. Acting means becoming stewards of what is good, true, and beautiful. To take responsibility is to refuse to leave the world's future to someone else, to some future promise, to some vague theology. To take responsibility is to recognize that this is our time, our world, our task. Snyder's final lesson is perhaps the simplest. Be as courageous as you can. He doesn't promise that courage will bring success. Instead, he reminds us that courage creates possibility. It opens the door to a better future, even when the path forward feels uncertain. Bravery doesn't always look like grand gestures. It can be the act of showing up at a march, a town hall, at the ballot box, especially when staying home would be easier and safer. It can mean not deleting your social media accounts and retreating to safe spaces. It can be leaving your pride flag flying. It can be the decision to speak out when others around you are silent. It can be speaking up for the truth, for our values, for someone more vulnerable than yourself, online, on the street, in the store, or the restaurant. It can be having that difficult conversation with that neighbor, coworker, family member, or stranger. And in these moments, your courage can very much feel like a fool's hope. It might feel small, reckless, even futile. But as we are reminded, justice does not arrive on its own. It does not fall out of the sky. Justice is created by those who dare to act even when the odds feel insurmountable. So be as courageous as you can. Not because courage guarantees success, but because courage creates possibility. It inspires courage. Courage inspires courage. Like a flame passes from candle to candle. Courage cracks open the door to a future we might not yet see, and it dares us to believe that our story is not finished. Courage is Frodo stepping onto the road, not knowing if he'll ever return home to the Shire. Courage is Gandalf rallying the scattered forces of light against an overwhelming shadow. Courage is the fool's hope that sustains our action even when our outcomes are unclear, even when the whole world is threatened. Courage in our time might look like 1,000 small acts of kindness, compassion, and respect. Acts to create networks and sustain communities of care. Acts that defend what is good and to keep imagining a future we all long to see. As we look to the uncertain road ahead, it is natural to wonder, what difference can we make? We are, after all, ordinary people. We do not wield the power of kings or the wisdom of wizards. Like hobbits, we may feel small and untested, unsure of our strength or the outcome of our efforts. But it is precisely this, the courage of the ordinary, that changes the world. As Gandalf tells us in the movie The Hobbit, quote, "Some believe it is only great power that can hold evil in check, but that is not what I have found. It is the small, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay. Small acts of kindness and love. Small acts where hope meets action. This ultimately changes the story and the world." As Unitarian Universalists, we are called to live not in certainty, but in faith. Faith that our small actions, when joined with others, can create a more just and compassionate world. Faith that even in the darkest of times, the possibility of something better still exists, if only we are brave enough to create it. If only we are brave enough to be it. Gandalf called it a fool's hope, but do not be mistaken. This is not childish optimism. This is not empty theology that promises that someday all will be well. Instead, this is the audacity to act, despite uncertainty, to hold to the belief that something better is possible even when we cannot see the way, even when all visible evidence tells us that our hope, is foolish. Because this hope, this kind of hope, it's not foolish. It's not naive. This kind of hope is the truest act of the defiant. It refuses to yield to despair or inaction. It acknowledges the darkness and still chooses to light a lamp anyway. A lamp, a candle, a chalice. And so, as we stand today in this deep breath before the plunge into the unknown, let us take up the small burdens that are ours to carry, trusting that together they amount to something greater. In the days ahead, may we act with courage, not because courage guarantees success, but because courage creates possibility. May we hold on to hope, not because the path is clear, but because the act of hoping itself shapes the future. May we find our strength, not because the journey will be easy, but because every step brings us closer to home. This is our moment of courage, not because we are mighty, but because we are a people who choose to act. We step forward together, not because we know the path is safe, but because we know this path is ours. The road is before us, the shadow is around us, but you and I, we are not lost. Our path was written long ago by friends, by causes, by our history and our values, our love and our stories. All of that lights our way. Amen.
Visit us at UUSG.org.